Hi, Jesse.
Morning. I probably won't be able to really talk or interact much at all on this one, but I can for like 1 minute.
Okay.
How are you?
All right, pretty good. How about yourself?
Oh, good. I've been going through a lot of the papers that you put in the sync, and I found some other stuff. So I found some interesting new things, like the work of Francisco Varela.
Oh, yeah.
He's kind of interesting. So I'm kind of exploring that, but more about all that later.
Well, good. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Hi, Abraham. How are you?
Oh, fairly well. How are you folks?
Oh, pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I guess we can start. People may be coming in later, but first of all, how are you guys doing so far? Have you found anything you want to follow up on that we've talked about in the meetings?
Not yet. Everything has been pretty good on my end. Lots of programming.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with what your specialty is, Abraham. What do you want to do, like with like machine learning specifically? But what's your research about?
Yeah. So I have a set of cell cycle biosensors, and I'm automating the analysis of them. So I have video microscopy, and I have some image segmentation problems, the tracking problem that we think is probably pretty intractable, so we're hand tracking cells, and then that provides us with sensor behavior over time, and then we have a time alignment of one-dimensional data problem followed by some stats. It's a very dry computer sciencey way of talking about exactly what it is that I'm doing, but the actual exciting biology that realizes is we're able to see all the phases of the cell cycle in living animals and correlate it to cell biological behaviors, including differentiation of complex cell types.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, I think cell cycles are really a neat area, like just in terms of like understanding how cells divide and the timing of it, especially. I used to work in the area of cellular reprogramming, and that was like one of the main things. If you want to understand how cells sort of reprogram, one of the things you have to understand is like how they divide and like what happens, when they decide to convert to a different fate or not.
Yeah.
So, and then so you're just kind of working on the cutting edge of that area. I take it. Yeah. So that sounds pretty good. Maybe at some point you can give a short, presentation on even if it's just on what you do. That would be good. Yeah. Let's see. Jesse has a comment. Mostly feeling my way towards a specific ML project, but not set on one yet. Okay. So I guess, let me talk about the pre-trained models. So I mentioned in the email that I was thinking more about pre-trained models, and as we talked about last week, we have these models that are, kind of, we want to use them to sort of classify training data so that we can build a nice model for some problem that we're interested in analyzing data that's, more diverse than the training set. So, but I think it's worth like going through the idea of pre-trained models just to kind of get an idea of what's out there. So
I'm using one. We're taking tape right now.
What are you using?
I'm using a UNet.
Okay.
But mine was pre-trained on satellite imagery. And the real value of the pre-training is it decreases the amount of time that it takes for the network to learn what an image is. Learning to recognize new types of shapes or different types of shapes, and to be accurate at that task is much, much faster once the network has a concept of images contain structural and shape information. So retraining from a network that has already developed the ability to pull shape information out of images is a much less daunting task in terms of computational time than starting from scratch.
Yeah, I actually, that was going to be my point on this. I think that one of the problems we have, of course, we saw in the digital bacillarea stuff, is that we don't have good models for biology. We have good models for, like, we'll see language and, like, maybe cars or, trees, but we don't, maybe more general problems too. But we don't have a good set of models for biology. And so it does require, I think, specific sort of model, sort of a set of assumptions that you wouldn't find in a more general model.
Sure.
Yeah. So let me go to the slides. I'll share my screen, and you'll find this interesting too, Jesse. I think we talked. You mentioned you were interested in a little bit when we talked on Slack. So let's see what we can. Let's just go through these and have a discussion about that. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is like pre-trained models for developmental biology. That's what I'm calling this. And this image here is actually sort of a graph of a lot of the pre-trained models that exist. And they're in this case, they're measuring the number of operations it takes to sort of train one of these versus the total accuracy. So, with these pre-trained models, you can throw them at a problem, and like Abraham said, it might take a while to train it at good accuracy, but you also have to worry about it overfitting or underfitting your data. So, if it overfits the data, it will predict, it'll predict that anything is a feature. If it's undertrained, it won't find any features at all in your data. So, if we go back to the spherical systems that we talked about last week, so these are two embryos. It's C. elegans embryogenesis, and this is Drosophila embryogenesis. And you can see, like, the embryogenetic process is very different in these two organisms. In Drosophila, you get this cellularization, and you have many more cells that are, forming some sort of shape that's going to become the larval stage. C. elegans, you have the same process, but it's largely cells dividing and moving around, and then they form, like they have like a comma stage, and they have other stages where they take, their shape is defined later on. But all of that, that requires us to characterize movement. That requires us to characterize, like, one feature becoming two features. And also it requires, some standardization of the process. So if you go from embryo to embryo, in C. elegans, for example, it's highly programmed, but there is still variation in the process. And so the variation isn't typical of, say, like a bunch of faces, where we can characterize human faces, we get a pretty good handle on, a face is a face. But with an embryo, we don't really know that. So, we talked about pre-trained models and, how they might be used. It's basically taking, say, a neural network and defining the parameters in advance, like some of the connections. And then people can use them to train their, put training data in and, kind of get an answer for their problem. But in biology, it might be a little bit tricky. But one of the things that I was thinking about over the week is that we have models of biological processes, especially models that map to, like, I'll call it a neural network. but one of those is the perception of biological motion. So in this case in biology, we have motion in the embryos, or whatever we're looking at. We usually do have motion in biological systems because we're looking at processes. In this case, we actually have a model of perception of motion, and what this is it comes from psychology actually. In the middle of the last century, a number of ecological psychologists started looking at uh, biological motion. So what this is where if you look at like uh, a, like a walking individual, like in this case you have two people walking across the scene on the right, uh, we don't recognize like the whole of the motion. Well, we're recognizing the whole of the motion, but we're doing it in a way that like focuses on specific parts of the walker. And so they've boiled it down to like these points. So they're just like points that you might see, like the knee, the foot, the hand. And they tested this on people, and people were able to recognize that as two people walking, even though there's not really two people walking. It's just two sets of points that are mimicking the walking motion. And so people have done this sort of experimentation for a long time, and they've gotten to the point where they've understood kind of a model for what's going on in the brain when we do that. And so they use, then this is very similar to what people do in machine learning, where they pick out features of the object. You don't necessarily have to analyze the entire object. You just pick out features and you relate them to one another in a way that's like makes sense of it. So in this case, we're looking at a cognitive model. And in a cognitive model, you have some input, some sort of sensory input. In this case, it's the vision of like this biological motion, and you pass it into some neurons, which extract the different components of motion. So you have a maximum and minimum sets of features, and then you integrate them, and then you represent these in a certain type of cell that is called a template cell. And this leads to two separate decisions derived from a compact representation. So what the brain does is it represents this information in this way that we see down here, these different points that are moving around. And then that information gets integrated into an entire, we recognize human movement because we recognize those cues and their movement, and we recognize that as movement. So you could actually create a fake situation where it looks sort of like a human, and you might still interpret it as a human moving, but it's not a human, it's some other thing. It could be like maybe just a set of wind chimes or something. And people actually, as you know, people misclassify objects maybe as human or animal motion all the time. So I mean, that's one area that I just thought about when I was thinking about this problem, is that cognitive models for this sort of thing might be useful. But another thing we have to think about is that there is this idea of process models where people have looked at, say, like pre-trained models. They've looked at neural simulations, and they've looked at cognitive models, and they've thought about like how they map to cognition and how they map to biology. So a pre-trained model, or even like a machine learning model, is mimicking the brain in some way. And so we're mimicking the brain in cognitive models. We're mimicking the cognition. We're not necessarily mimicking the brain. So if you look back at this model, we have neurons in it, but we're really interested in the representation. Conversely, something like the Blue Brain Project or Hodgkin and Huxley is where you're modeling a biological neuron, but you don't really care so much about what it does in terms of cognition. But what's interesting here is that these pre-trained models and deep learning models sit kind of in between this. And so they sit in between cognitive models and sort of like, high fidelity biological models. And so, for something like biology, it might be interesting if we sort of, adopted maybe some of these attributes as well, where we actually maybe used something that resembled more of a cognitive model than a typical pre-trained model. I only say that because, we know how to interpret biology. In developmental biology, there's a history of people kind of looking in under microscope slides and, interpreting things through drawings or through some other. Hi, Vinay. How are you?
Hi, sir.
So I was just talking about pre-trained models, and I was entertaining some thoughts here. I was talking about, actually, right now I'm talking about something called process models, which is taking deep learning and pre-trained models and putting them in the context of like cognitive models and like models of neurons. And so I was mentioning that we may be able to do something interesting by mimicking cognitive models rather than something like a typical pre-trained model. I'll make these slides available to people and we can have a discussion about this. We could do it here and then we can do it later. So I just want to get people's feedback. So this is from a paper called Cognitive Computational Neuroscience. So this isn't from like the machine learning literature. This is more of a cognitive neuroscience approach, but there are ties. I wanted people to be aware of the ties between the two areas. So why don't we go through some pre-trained models that exist. There is one that just came out, and this is actually it's very closely allied with biology in that it's a deep learning kit for looking at animal poses and movement. And so this is Deep Pose Kit, and this is something that there are people in here who have done like collective behavior and emergence type work. Like Ian Kuzin, who does a lot of stuff with like bird flocks. So I mean, that's where I think these people are coming from on this. They're from like an animal behavior kind of background, and they've developed this kit, which is a set of animal poses, and they're able to estimate movement from that. And so this GIF isn't running here, but it shows a bunch of things moving around, and they're able to predict the movement from that. And so, again, in this case, you're not using a traditional pre-trained model, but you're using something that's inspired by sort of what we know about animal behavior. And so in this case, they use something called a stack dense net model. And so they're using this sort of process where they're taking input images and they're augmenting them using augmented data. So here again, the augmented data augmentation strategy, they have this input of a fly, and then they have it in different poses, And so when the fly's moving, they're in these different poses. You take static images and you put them together. And then you run this network. There's some math here. But the basic idea is that you're able to take, features and take some of these poses and put them in a graph and then get some sort of prediction of movement. But the movement, is based on sort of what we know about the biology, not necessarily just, well, here's a model that, works on language processing or on, classifying cars, and we'll apply it to movement. So they took a little bit different approach here. But still, this isn't a cognitive model. This is more of just a regular sort of, machine learning type model, but they sort of informed it with biology. But then there are also other types of pre-trained models. One that's has a very lengthy blog post behind it is the GPT-2 model. And so this is an example of a pre-trained model for language processing where they've been able to train it on language processing. But, if you use it for another purpose, you might not get the kind of result that you want. And again, it's like very good for its task domain, but it doesn't necessarily transfer very well. But if you want to understand pre-trained models, that's a good place to go to this blog post. They'll explain to you some aspects of it, how it works, how they train it with data, and so forth. And so in this case, you find that a lot of things, they train it with a lot of data, first of all. So, it takes a lot of data, but there might be cases where you create pre-trained models that don't require a lot of data. In fact, it depends if you're looking at a problem in biology that's hard to characterize, you might not want to have a lot of input data or rely on that because you just don't have the data that you can throw at it. And in this blog post, you get an idea of the scale of data that you need, and it's a little intimidating, but that's what sometimes they need to do to make these pre-trained models work. Another example from language processing, and this is an area called NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. It's called FastBERT, and this is a simple deep learning library. So in this case, they do 2 steps. They do like a semi-supervised training step on a large amount of text. So they just throw a lot of data at it, and then the next step, they supervise the training. They label a data set, and they put that into the algorithm, and they're able to benefit from the semi-supervised step. So semi-supervised means that you have text that's sort of has labels and sort of doesn't. You're throwing words at the model. Sometimes it knows the context. Sometimes it knows Sometimes it knows the meaning. Sometimes it doesn't. There are a lot of it's very diverse in that way. And then with the supervised training, you have something with a formal label. And then from that, they can create a pre-trained model that can encounter a lot of different cases. But in that, in this case, again, you need a lot of input data to do it. So that's all I have for this. I just wanted to go through a couple of pre-trained models and get a little bit of feedback from people as to what they, maybe they think about like pre-trained models. Maybe Jesse actually mentioned that he was interested in pursuing that a little bit further, at least in terms of thinking about like, how we might create one for biology. So.
I think there are a bunch of different tasks that we would ideally want to be able to do, and the different types of network architectures are going to be better at different types of tasks, right?
Yeah.
So you have, on the one hand, you have movement classification, which requires feature identification, right, as well. And in general, you will also have simple segmentation problems, and I guess that there are a bunch of other types of problems that you can attack with neural networks pretty effectively. And I think there are generally there's a lot of network for these different types of tasks, and the problem often I think becomes which of these architectures do I try for this task, and the data hungriness is a real problem, particularly when you need to hand label your data, and that can take really long periods of time. Which is where the having a pre-trained architecture that knows what an image is or knows what my data type is can be an absolute lifesaver. But having a model that simply is able to understand the structure of the information type that you're feeding it already decreases the amount of data you need to feed it by like an order of magnitude, and that makes things a lot less painful.
Yeah.
and so there's definitely value in having pre-trained models. But I think there's also a question of what is the precise task that you want to tackle. Right? Do we want to tackle motion? Do we want to tackle feature detection? Do we want to tackle identification? Do we want to tackle segmentation? And the architectures that are most effective at each of those different tasks are currently different. We don't have a general purpose neural network structure yet that'll do any task you throw at it. And I think I don't necessarily know that we work that way either. We use different neural network structures to do different tasks.
Right.
And then we supervise which one we're passing it to. That's sort of how our brain works. It's centralized, but it's still sort of distributed processing, right? Because you have these regions on the cortex that are associated with different behaviors, right? You have a sensory homunculus that's laid out on your brain cortex, and you have a visual cortex, and you have all these other structures that are associated with specific types of processing tasks that have the appropriate network architecture for those particular tasks. And then there's some sort of classification system that passes the problem to the right group of neurons, right? And so at the end of the day, I don't necessarily know that you can get to a general purpose solution by building a single network so much as building a bunch of very specialized networks and figuring out a way to figure out which one you want. Right now, the problem is, I think, the barrier to entry for a lot of us, other than the density of the descriptions and the amount of options that are out there, is understanding which model is most likely to behave well on our data. And that's a real challenge, because we are that classifying function that decides what our data type is and what model is going to work the best. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that definitely it's and the whole idea of having a general model. I think though that's what's assumed in a lot of the pre-trained models is that we kind of can create one model, and there are these universal features that you'll be able to extract. So, I mean, that's kind of the principle behind statistics, that you can take a measurement and then apply statistical tests, and then no matter what your data is, if it's like, defects in manufactured goods, or like people in a sporting event, or like, cells, just like a broad range of things that you can measure, but you should be able to use this one set of tests. I mean, now, there are a lot of statistical tests, which maybe suggests that, that kind of universality doesn't really exist. There are a lot of assumptions that need to make for, different problems. So yeah, I agree that you have to, I don't think that there is necessarily a general solution. But that barrier to entry you mentioned is actually pretty important too. I think, I've seen a lot of people like kind of jump into myself included, kind of jump into the area, and it's like, what is the best model for the kind of data we're using? That's why I did this. I wanted to focus on this a little bit because, we don't really know what the best model is, and we kind of just have to use trial and error to get there. Yeah.
So maybe we want to develop a network that looks at your data type and sorry, the classic joke of, I have a problem, how can I use a neural network to solve it? There's yeah, I think that the you know on the general purpose side, right? If I try to feed linguistic data to a UNet, the UNet will not be able to do anything with it because it's been built to handle a particular data type, and that data has a particular type of structure to it and is multidimensional, right?
Right.
And if I attempt to hand the UNet does a really good job of segmenting images into foreground, background pixels, right? And if I attempt to hand my imaging data to an SVM model, I'm going to get nothing out.
Yeah.
Because the SVM model has been developed and does a really good job at processing language data. And I spend a lot of time with linguists because of long personal reasons.
Okay.
So I talk a lot about the models that get used in linguistic modeling of stuff. I have a bunch of friends that work on that, but what they do and what I do are very different sorts of tasks. And I get questions like, "Oh, how can we apply this to biology?" And I'm like, "Okay, well, where in biology is there a data type that is even remotely related to linguistic data?" And the closest that I could get for them was, well, we have sequence data, which has the right number of dimensions, is one dimension. And you can, in principle, break it up into units that are word-like, and then you have genes and promoters and other elements. You can treat it as language in that sense. And then you can attempt to use that hammer to approach a problem of parsing genetic information. But it doesn't, it's very much I have a hammer, let me find a nail that works with it kind of problem in that sense,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very very good observation too. I noticed that like in very early bioinformatics, they used to focus on gene sequences, and then you can use linguistic models. Like a lot of people like to use HMM models, which are hidden Markov models on that are kind of for both linguistics and for sequence data, and it works. But then it depends on what you want to get out of the sequence data. If it's it's not really structured exactly like language, so you have to find a model that's sort of abstract enough to deal with that. But then there are certain assumptions of the model that don't necessarily fit the data. So it's always kind of like your and I think a lot of times in bioinformatics in particular, they try to modify the models to sort of fit into the assumptions. So there's like they're like platforms like they might use a hidden Markov model, but they might have they might tweak it to conform to certain assumptions about gene sequence data, that sort of thing. So it's good to kind of look at what other areas of modeling you're doing. Actually, you also have platforms like go back to agent-based models where you get a package that does agent-based modeling. Oftentimes they'll come with templates, which are like they have different sort of scenarios built into them. So like you have an agent-based modeling program, and it has like models for like famous cellular automata models, or they might have models for different game theoretic games. I was just working with a package where we're looking at like Prisoner's Dilemma models. So you'd have a agent-based model, and you'd go in and you'd say, well, this is a good so I guess a submodel for what I want to do. I want to look at this problem in terms of the prisoner's dilemma, and then you might have variations on that, and it's all sort of pre-coded, so it gives you like a model to work from. But then again, you have to make sure that your data fits the assumptions of that model, and that's the hard part, is getting that right, because sometimes if you violate the assumptions, you get a result that's not exactly realistic.
Yep.
Yeah. So
I think that there's. this is sort of a joke, but not entirely. There's an entire academic field that does this all the time, and it's economics.
Oh yeah.
Hello, I'm going to go take these gas law equations and use them to model human behavior by removing half of the variables. So there is precedent for doing this sort of a task. But at the end of the day, as we are repeatedly shown, those models that, gas law equations don't do a terribly good job of modeling human behavior.
Yeah.
There's a lot of repurposed hardware type problems here that occur when you try to make, the best economic models, are based on these gas law models right now, and they're terrible.
Yeah.
Don't do a good job of modeling what's going to happen.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's like a whole area of inquiry, I guess. I've seen a couple papers actually come out that talk about people are kind of questioning these assumptions where you find something that's universal. I think power laws is one example from complexity theory. So about 20 years ago, everyone thought that there were power laws in networks and in all sorts of things. And then now people are reevaluating and saying, was it really a power law or is there more to it? Because the idea of a power law is that you have this one statistical signature and it's supposed to be, equivalent across all these different domains. And then, is that really the case, or are we just kind of looking at many different things that are very similar, but we kind of use a statistical model to, claim that there are these, deep, deep fundamental things that all these systems share. It's, but it is relevant to applying, your data to a model because you do have to make that assumption at some level. But like I said, there may be cases, there may be opportunities to look at cognitive models, which are, models of how the brain actually, processes say biological information as sort of a key to maybe how that can be done, in a more specific way. The problem is how would we code that and how would we throw data at it? Would that be something that would be feasible? I know people are doing using cognitive models sort of to look at maybe for data analysis, but that's so models even like that are a little bit tricky to implement. So I guess Jesse and Vinay, do you have any thoughts on this or?
Yeah, I find everything relevant to what I've experienced also because with pre-trained models, I had the same experiences. Sometimes it worked very well, sometimes it did not work. So maybe my choice of selecting of the model was bad, but I still have to experiment a lot of things on that for pre-trained models. As also, I think this using of pre-trained models will be encouraged because popular frameworks like TensorFlow and PyTorch have these hubs. If you go to TensorFlow hub, they have a set of all the pre-trained models on different for different tasks. For suppose for segmentation, for text generation, and so on. So I think it's a widely used practice, and if we have the right amounts of data, and I think we can use one of these models and see. It's better to use one of these models and see how the results are there.
Yeah, so I see that the TensorFlow has a new version out.
Yes, sir. In this, the Google I/O 19, they announced TensorFlow Alpha to 2.0 Alpha, and yesterday it got officially released. Like the stable version got released. So they have a lot of new changes. Basically, in the the previous TensorFlow versions, there were so many APIs. There's a tf.nn and tf.layers and tf.contrib.layers. So there are different APIs. So what the major update, what I see is that they removed all of those things and they maintained only a single API, that is tf.keras API, and also the TensorFlow lower API. So previously it was like we need to choose between different APIs, like which one we needed to experiment with different APIs from TensorFlow, and now there's only now they became a type bound with keras actually. So that I think is the major update, and all the documentation updation has been done. So I'm really excited to like see what will happen.
Yeah, definitely. So do you have experience, of course, in like like in the working with the embryos? Like, have you worked with what kinds of different data have you worked with? Have you used pre-trained models for different types of data? What's your experience?
When I used pretrained models when I was in a hackathon, because I did not have the time to build the model from the scratch. So it was related to object detection. So there's this model called YOLO. You only look once.
Yeah.
So it's a famous model. So I had to download the weights of the model, and then I just loaded that into my Python script, and then I did the automation for that. That was one experience where I used pre-trained models, and also during my initial GSOC time, I tried to use this mask RCNN pre-trained model as well to see how it works on our embryo images. But as we did not have any labels, so I couldn't move any further with that. Apart from that, I haven't worked much on those pre-trained models. But when I worked on this YOLO model, it worked really well. Like it identified even the occluded objects as well. Like if the object is abstracted, like half of the object is abstracted from the viewpoint, even then it was able to identify the object. So as these pre-trained models are trained on different kinds of data on clouds, on heavy hardware clouds, I think we can trust them enough.
Yeah, I think we can trust them. Yeah, it's just a matter of like, if we have a certain type of data, what are we using something that maybe is trained in a totally different domain, and then I guess the first question is, maybe is there a domain of data? So like we have data isn't universal necessarily. There might be some aspects of it that are generalizable across data types, but there are data types that have very distinct things. So like if you had a bunch of M&Ms on a table and you took a picture and you asked the algorithm to pick out the M&Ms, if you used maybe something that was specialized for linguistics, that may not be very good. If you pick something that's optimized for object detection, for blobs or something, color changes, then it would probably do a very good job of picking them up. And so, but then that's a very general level. But still, you see the differences between different types of data. So I think that's actually important too, is understanding what are the attributes of the data that maybe a pre-trained model might be selecting for. And this just goes in general for machine learning. Is it do we have to get down to the level of is it blobs versus symbols, or what is it about what is that? What there are differences in the different types of data, and maybe that means that we have fundamentally different things we need to do to it to understand it.
Yeah, like I was talking about this hackathon, right? In that hackathon, I wanted to identify cheetahs or jaguars or panthers. So when I was using this YOLO pre-trained model, that YOLO pre-trained model can only identify the common objects that we see, like let's say a fan or chair or laptop, handbag, and those kinds of objects. So what we did was we removed the last layers. That is like it had some 50 objects, I think, around 50. I don't remember the number. So we removed the last layer. We freezed the model. We removed the last layers, and we added a new like a new class that is our cheetah and jaguar class. So we found this thing on blogs. Like this is a very famous thing. Like if I searched training pre-trained models and our custom data. So I landed on some blog post and then I tried it. So when I tried it, I found it to be as accurate as the original model only, because we trained it for a very long time and we had a very nice set of data. So I think it will work with our custom data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's yeah, a lot of those kind of strategies are going to be useful. Yeah, it's very interesting. Let's see, Abraham, I think, posted a link to a paper. William Bialik, who's a famous physicist, dimensionality and dynamics in the behavior of C. elegans. You pick something that is DevoWorm approved, I guess. Let's see. I think I've seen this paper before. Let me share my screen. The link is in your chat if you want to follow along. So this is a major challenge in analyzing animal behavior, is to discover some underlying simplicity in complex motor actions. So yes, this is where they analyze the behavior or the movement behavior of C. elegans, where partially reconstruct equations, emotions from dynamics in this space. I think this is, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, this is a paper that people have passed around in the OpenWorm group. Like OpenWorm has a group called Movement Validation, and so they've actually done some really good work. Let me give you a link to their database. You might find it interesting if you're. I think it should be up. It was down for a while. But they have like a lot of movement data there, and they have like it's a movement database, but they have done some analysis on this. So they, you might look over that site to get a sense of what people are doing with like worm movement. So yes, this is where they come up with the eigenworms. So this is where they actually take the data and they boil it down to like, they use dimensionality reduction. And so, there are a lot of statistical techniques that we aren't talking about directly here, like dimensionality reduction and other things that are nevertheless actually quite useful, aside from like the hardcore machine learning algorithms, like things like good old PCA are pretty effective. Abraham, is there anything you wanted to say about this paper? Or?
Oh, it was kind of relevant to multiple conversations, right? One here you have a purpose-built statistical model of animal behavior, right?
Yeah.
And two, you have forgot what the second thing was, but it was in particular relevant to the classification of movement type things. And here they've taken an approach where they've basically developed mathematical space in which they basically constrained the space in which these movements normally operate,
right.
Which then they decided to apply now. Go and measure an animal, and it's outside of this space. Right?
Yeah.
At least I definitely think weird.
Yeah. So I mean, this is.
And that'd be good.
Okay. Yeah, you're breaking up pretty bad. Yeah. Let me stop sharing my screen, actually. Okay. Okay.
But I don't be able to. But
yeah, yeah. Actually, I couldn't hear part of that. Could you type it in the chat? I could read it back to the group because it was it broke up a lot. So yeah, I mean this is a good example of the kind of thing that and again, this isn't like machine learning, but like it's something that is useful. So like in the movement group, they take a lot of microscopy images of worm movement, and then they analyze it, and they use this kind of space, like a reference space for the movement. So you're like basically finding modes of movement. Now in C. elegans, that's relatively easy only because the worm's movements are stereotypical. So like, if you're analyzing human dance, it might be a little bit harder because there's a lot of like improvisation and there's like, a lot of different degrees of freedom. With C. elegans, of course, it's easier, but then it's maybe not as easy to like really kind of confirm that you have modes. I mean, we're just using the human visual system and we're saying, yeah, we can see modes of movement, under a microscope. So, I mean, that's why we want to have like a statistical model. But then, this actually is a pretty good way to do this. So, they use this term eigenworms. It's just, finding, eigenvalues and eigenvectors of, coming from these movement modes. And then they use it for Jesse. I know he's interested in attractor basins and that. They do actually use attractor models of movement, so they're actually able to create, different attractors for different postures of the worm. So there's some dynamical system stuff in here as well. Yeah. So let's see what our chat we have here in the chat. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's fine, Abraham. Thank you for the paper. It was very interesting. So, and then Jesse says, definitely interested in the cognitive modeling aspects. These slides or videos will be online somewhere. Missing chunks now and then. Yeah, I'll post the video and the slides. I'll actually post it on Slack for you. Jesse, do you have anything else to add or any thoughts? Okay, yeah, that's fine. And if you have any questions over the course of the week, if any like insights, you can post them in Slack. So thanks for attending. Okay, we're coming up towards the top of the hour. So next week we'll see what if I can get someone else. Does anyone want to contribute something next week? Do you have any ideas that you want, even if it's just like a couple slides and bring up an issue that you want to talk about? We can talk about it. Okay. So you don't have to let me know right now, but let me know before next week. We could, I can send out an email a couple days before the meeting, and we can, we can find a topic. I mean, there are a lot of topics we can talk about. It doesn't have to be super polished, but just something to ignite some conversation, because I think it's useful to. These were very good conversations today, so I'm glad that we got some, discussed this a little bit. And okay, so let me know if you have any questions